Good afternoon, everyone, colleagues, friends. Oh, something. So I'm Otuan Ren, the Associate Director of the Center for Catholic Studies. So on behalf of the center, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to lecture. We are deeply honored to host this event and especially grateful to our distinguished speaker and respondents. It is a privilege to welcome Professor Lefebure, a leading scholar in interreligious dialogue and comparative theology from Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit university in US. Professor Lefebure's work has been instrumental in advancing Buddhist-Christian studies, particularly through his thoughtful engagement with questions of method, doctrine, and lived religious practices. His scholarship amplifies a theological approach that is both intellectually rigorous and deeply attentive to the spiritual traditions he brings into conversation. We're delighted to have him with us today. We're also honored to have two distinguished respondents. Professor Chiu is well known for his contributions to Christian theology, public theology in the Chinese context, and dialogue between Buddhism, Confucianism, and Christianity. His work constantly demonstrates how theological reflection can be enriched through cross-cultural and interreligious engagement. Joining him is Professor Tam Wai Lun, a prominent scholar in religious studies whose research spans Buddhism, Chinese religions, and interreligious dialogue. His interdisciplinary approach and sensitivity to historical and cultural context promise to offer valuable insights into the methodological questions raised this afternoon. By the way, we are co-organizing this event with the Center for Buddhist Studies, and Professor Tam is the director of this center. So today's lecture invites us not only to consider Buddhist-Christian encounter as an object of study, but also to reflect critically on the methods through which such encounters are approached, interpreted, and lived. This is a timely and important conversations for scholars, practitioners, and all those committed to serious interreligious understandings. So once again, welcome all of you, and thank you for joining us. We look forward to stimulating lecture and rich exchange of ideas. So, yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Ren. I'm very happy to be back here. I have fond memories of my earlier visits to the Chinese University of Hong Kong, but it's been 10 years since my last visit. So I'm very happy to be back and appreciate the responses from my dear colleagues here. So researchers in the field of Buddhist-Christian studies make a number of choices that shape the methods they employ. First is, do they study the relations from the perspective of committed practice in one particular religion, or from the practice of more than one religious tradition, two or more? Is that even possible? Or do they approach this from an allegedly neutral standpoint, not committed to any particular position, but as academic scholars not identifying with a religious tradition? Another question related to this is how to relate Buddhist studies, Buddhist-Christian studies, to methodological debates in the cognate disciplines of religious studies, Christian theology, and Buddhology, or Buddhist studies. And then finally, there's a question kind of like a gestalt. Do you emphasize points of convergence or points of divergence? So the decisions that people make shape the whole discussion. If you read the older literature, many scholars like Hans Küng framed Buddhist Christian studies as a comparison within what's called the world religions paradigm. And so this set up certain expectations about what a religion is, what it looks like, what it does. This model has been very severely criticized in recent decades for imposing a model of religions largely come out of the European Christian imperial period and distorting other religious traditions. In the United States, which is my context, there's a huge debate over all these questions, over the meaning of the word religion. And I understand in Chinese studies, it's a question, what does the word religion mean? Because it's not indigenous in a sense. In America, there's even one archaeologist, anthropologist, wants to get rid of the word religion altogether and call it doings. He wrote a book on early indigenous peoples in the Southwest, but I think the publisher probably made him put Pueblo religion in the subtitles so people would know what the book was about. So the whole topic of religious studies is in flux. Related to this is the query, should Buddhism be viewed as a religion or not? And there's no agreement on this. It depends on what do you mean by religion? How are you looking at Buddhism? There have been various efforts to resolve this. One influential sociologist at University of Chicago, Martin Riesebrot, claimed that salvation as a promise is common to all religions. But then people involved in Buddhist-Christian dialogue, like S. Mark Heim, point out Buddhists and Christians have profoundly different understandings of salvations. So I remember at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1993, the Korean Venerable Sung Sang got up and said, the Buddha did not come to save us. The Buddha came to tell us we don't need to be saved. So whatever topic you name as kind of the core of what religions are supposed to deliver can be questioned. So we have a wide diversity of practices and there's no agreement. So related to this is the alleged discipline of comparative religion. But scholars like Hugh Nicholson point out most of the people in the academic study of religious studies, so not committed practitioners, they tend away from the traditional model of comparative religion, where you try to do large-scale comparisons. They tend to see religious studies as a part of area studies and do this in light of postmodernism and post-colonial studies. And so often it's more of an area. So they might approach religious diversity, say, as a sociologist or political scientist or cultural anthropologist, looking at a particular region, but not the abstraction of Buddhism or Christianity on a large scale. Related to this, there's a debate over what's the responsibility of scholars of religion. Practitioners think they can be both scholars and also practitioners. People like Russell McCutcheon say, no, you can't do that. You can't be a caretaker and also a critic. And so here, religious studies often tends toward a critical view. And again, there's a whole spectrum within religious studies, some of which can be quite hostile to religious practice. There can be various forms of reductionism where scholars see religious practice as only a reflection of sociology, cultural anthropology, or whatever. Then there's pushback against these. Robert Orsi called McCutcheon's method chilling. Rosemary Radford Ruther used to say, these types of critics can't distinguish objectivity from hostility. And so all of this is in play in the United States right now. Similarly, there's questions over the cognitive science of religion. So especially with the developments in neurology, there's all kinds of very interesting explorations going on. Someone like Hugh Nicholson tends to see this as naturalistic, meaning there's no supernatural transcendent dimension of religion. It's simply a natural byproduct of ordinary cognitive processes. So again, kind of a reductionist approach. Others do religious studies in a non-reductionist way. So my main warning is don't overgeneralize about these people. So people like Ulrich Lutz and Axel Michaels did a joint study drawing on historical criticism and social science, encountering Jesus and Buddha. And then there's a team, Andrew Newberg, Eugene D'Aquili, Vincent Rouse, did a study on the brains of meditators. So they looked at Catholic Franciscan women and then Tibetan practitioners who do long-term meditation. And they found physiologically there are differences, but they're not trying to reduce this to simply biological, biochemical processes. Also related to this is the question of comparative theology. Do we stress the radical discontinuity between Buddhism and Christianity? When I met Professor Nagao Gajin in Japan years ago, he told me Christians believe in God, Buddhists don't. All the words mean something different. So he didn't see any possibility of dialogue. So you can argue for radical discontinuity. The other extreme, people like Paul Knitter and the late Roger Haight, they tend to use the Christian term God and shunyata as synonyms. It's the same reality, just named in different ways. So some people go towards identity, some people go towards radical discontinuity, and there's a whole series of positions in between. Myself, I think it's important to keep in mind both the divergence and the convergence as in play. But you'll find various scholars in different levels here. There's also a whole debate over theology of religions. Can you be framed on a level of exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism? And this has been very, very influential, but also been challenged by just about everybody. Though Perry Schmidt-Leukel is still defending this model very strongly. So exclusivists think only their way offers the true path to reality, salvation. And a lot of traditional Christians and a lot of traditional Buddhists thought only their path would get you out of suffering. Then there's people who are inclusivists who think their path is the core, but others can be included in this in a broad sense. Karl Rahner used to talk about people as anonymous Christians. So the Japanese Buddhist Keiji Nishitani asked him, what would you say if I call you an anonymous Zen Buddhist? And Rahner, this is typical of Karl Rahner, gave this complex answer that he said he would be honored to be called an anonymous Zen Buddhist. He said, to be a genuine Zen Buddhist is identical with being a genuine Christian in the sense directly and properly intended by such statements. Of course, he went on, in terms of objective social awareness, it is indeed clear that the Buddhist is not a Christian and the Christian is not a Buddhist. Nishitani agreed that on this point, we are entirely at one. Now, there's a lot of people who just question the premises of the whole debate. John Hick tried to resolve it by saying there's a pluralism where everybody is headed towards either God or the real in roughly equivalent ways. And here it's often Theravada Buddhists that say, no, we don't fit this model. That it's basically a theistic model that Hick tried to expand to include Buddhists who don't believe in a God who creates. But even here, I've heard Theravada Buddhists say it just doesn't work for them. In response, other scholars try to throw out this model and then do something different, but there's no alternate model that has found widespread acceptance up to the present time. So Abraham Beles de Sea looks at the Pali canon of Buddhism in light of these categories and says, yeah, most traditional Buddhists were exclusivist. Only Buddhism gives you the path out of suffering. And he wants to read the teaching of Shakyamuni in the Pali text as broader. He makes up the term pluralist inclusivist. So in some way, it's the ultimate truth, but other paths can in some way participate in this as well. Rita Gross, who was a great scholar of American Buddhism, she, as an American Buddhist, just thought the whole decision was misplaced, that she criticized the method for posing modern Western typology on the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. And she posed the question, why does religious diversity seem to be a problem? How do we flourish with religious diversity given that it is inevitable? And she thought, on a cosmic scale, we can't determine the truth of these claims. Everybody has their own starting points. From your starting points, you can make your argument, but there's no framework that gives everybody equal access to making their argument. And so a lot of people think the whole model doesn't quite work. Jim Fredericks made a valiant proposal to bracket the whole series of questions and then just do comparative studies. But people pointed out, but you have your own implicit assumptions about other religions. And so at the end of the day, Jim admitted publicly he had a theology of religions, and he adopted the theology of the Holy Spirit of Pope John Paul II as his own position on this. So comparative theologians at least make implicit assumptions about the status of other religious traditions, but there's no universally acceptable way of carrying this out. Hugh Nicholson questions the continuity within each tradition. He stresses how later interpreters often were very creative in developing the tradition away from what was claimed to be the founder. In a sense, Nicholson is recycling older arguments. For centuries, Protestants have told Catholics that they were just making things up and were not following the scriptures. And in the Buddhist world, for centuries, Theravada Buddhists have told Mahayana Buddhists they were just making it up and not staying with the original scriptures of the Buddha. So this whole question of continuity appears in one format or another again and again. What I find most helpful, and what I'm going to use for the rest of my discussion, is a fourfold model that has been proposed by the Vatican. But also it comes from like a scholar like Winston King, who studied the Theravada Buddhism in Burma, very, very similar to what the Vatican proposed. It's a fourfold model. We begin with dialogue of life. De facto, we are neighbors on the same planet. So this is the overall impetus to dialogue. How do we live together as good neighbors? Secondly, if we can be good neighbors, how do we act together for common values? So even though we differ on many beliefs, we share concerns if we're neighbors. Third is the dialogue of theological exchange. This is the more academic, philosophical side. This is what university people do, but it's not the total dialogue. It's one aspect, but it's not everything. And then finally is the dialogue of religious and spiritual experience, where people share what this means in terms of their religious and spiritual practice. And so what I would like to do now is reflect on some aspects of Buddhist-Christian dialogue, basically talking about the practitioners. So academic scholars can study all this, but I'll be attending more to the Buddhist and Christian practitioners that I have known. So first is the dialogue of life. We inherit a troubled past. So in many areas of Asia today, Buddhists are very suspicious when Catholics show up wanting to do Buddhist-Catholic dialogue, because there's memories of the imperial period, and sometimes missionaries came in with the empires. Each case is distinct, so you can't generalize about all of them. But there's deep, deep suspicions. I mean, I heard one Thai Buddhist tell us that, you know, if you ask ordinary Thai Buddhists, he wasn't saying this himself. He said a lot of Thai Buddhists think Buddhist-Catholic dialogue is a Vatican plot to take over the Buddhist world. And then they're gearing up for a big struggle with Muslims. So they see it in terms of confrontation and dominance. I heard one Vietnamese Buddhist woman based in Los Angeles say for her, Buddhist-Catholic dialogue was a huge revelation. And she went to all her friends and said, not all Catholics are bad. There's a few good ones. And so this was, again, these old memories. I mean, this is, the Dalai Lama has said this publicly. His image of Catholics was very negative because of the imperial period until he met Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton represented a monastic and mystical tradition that the young Dalai Lama thought Buddhists could learn from. And so often, the proper response to the negative prejudices that passed is to show up, to listen deeply to our dialogue partner, and then move beyond the images that we've inherited and try to shape healthy neighborly relationships today. And here, post-colonial scholarship has given us a lot of tools to show how often the Christian imperial power shaped Buddhist-Christian relations. And at times, this really shaped the Buddhist-Christian studies. So often you can find polemical Christian pieces that want to make Christianity look good and Buddhism look bad. And then Buddhists fight back. So you can find Buddhists make Christianity look bad, often because of a defensive reaction that's totally interesting. You can find this in Sri Lanka, for example. So this is all part of the heritage that we're dealing with. But in the meantime, there's a lot of positive things that have been going on. And a lot of people on both sides have tried to take initiatives towards reconciliation and resilience. So in terms of methods, Martin Leiner at the University in Jena, Germany, has founded the International Association of Reconciliation Studies, trying to form as an academic discipline the study in an interdisciplinary format of how do we heal wounds. Similarly, there are studies of resilience. People go through trauma. Some people are crippled by it. Some people are resilient and bounce back and go on to be very productive. What's going on there? The last Vatican-sponsored International Buddhist-Christian Colloquium met last May in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, on the theme, Seeking Peace Through Reconciliation and Resilience. And so a number of us spoke. I was one of the keynote speakers for the opening of it. One scholar, Robert Bordone, he's a Catholic lawyer teaching at Harvard Law School, has a book, Conflict Resilience. And if you read the book, it's written with a neurologist on brain science. But then in his interviews, this is all serving the agenda of Pope Francis on Fratelli Tutti. How do we shape a culture of encounter? Pope Francis used this as a term of culture in which everyone is respected, in which we move beyond the wounds of the past towards a culture where we value each form of religious practice. And so these would be examples of kind of interdisciplinary scholarship coming together. And like from the Buddhist side, Japanese Buddhists in Risho Kosekai, they went to the Philippines and publicly apologized to the Filipino population for what the Japanese Empire did during World War II during that period. So there's a lot of good people aware of the problematic past in places on both sides that we need to move beyond. So if we can establish trust, second stage then is the dialogue of action. So here we focus on common concerns. So if we're going to be good neighbors, how can we collaborate? And the hope is that interreligious dialogue can be a force multiplier to the decision makers in the public sphere. And so if an individual religious leader comes to a politician, okay, that's one hearing. But if you have a group that come together with shared concerns, that can be more influential in changing things. And in our world today, often there are societal, social, economic, political, ecological challenges. I mean, two of the main problems that I am concerned about are ethnic religious nationalism on the one side and the ecological challenge on the other. Both of these appear in different ways around the world, and Buddhists and Christians often have a lot of values that allow us to work together in addressing these issues. And then it's a question, what do you do with intellectual differences? Havanpola Ratanasara was from Sri Lanka. He was one of the great Theravada leaders in the Los Angeles area. He used to say, don't mix the doctrines, help the world. So he said, I quote, in the religious journey, we have two ways of moving ahead. There's no need and it's not possible to bridge this gap. So he's stressing the differences on a cognitive belief level in terms of worldview. Let us respect each other and get together and work for the peace of humankind. Then in social concerns, there are some Buddhists who respect the methods of Christian liberation theology. Liberation theology reads the gospel from the perspective of the poor and expresses a preferential option for the poor, and sees this as coming from God and then challenging Christians to be for all people, but with a special concern for the poor. Buddhists like John McCransky, scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, he completely embraces this. So as a Buddhist, he wants to do a Buddhist liberation theology. Other Buddhists don't agree. So Thich Nhat Hanh one of the most prominent Vietnamese Buddhists, died a couple years ago. He rejects any preferential option. And he writes, now he's a Buddhist, but he has his own kind of Buddhist-inspired interpretation of Christianity. And so he, as a Buddhist, speaks about God's will, intending the God of Christianity. He writes, I quote, "I do not think God wants us to take sides, even with the poor. The rich also suffer, in many cases more than the poor. When we take sides, we misunderstand the will of God." So here you have a great contrast. Karen Enriquez tries to bridge the contrast between liberation theology and Thich Nhat Hanh using studies of intersectionality and feminist studies. So she's relating poverty to issues other than class and challenging that Christians can learn from Buddhist descriptions of the subtle forms of suffering. And so it's well known that some Buddhists and some Christians have accepted various forms of nationalism, militarism, ethnocentrism, racial bias. And so here we need to draw upon studies of racism, reconciliation, and nonviolent conflict transformation. One of the relatively new developments in North America is the development of African American Buddhism. So some African Americans have embraced Buddhist practice. Sometimes, if they're growing up in the South, they were just totally turned off by the racism of much of the white Christian establishment. So white racist Christian nationalism totally contradicts the teachings of Jesus, but this is having a resurgence in the United States right now. It's one of our major problems. So this runs throughout our history. And there's all kinds of bias in American history, anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-American Indian. So this is all part of the troubled context of American practice. So Jan Willis grew up in a Baptist church. As an adult, she became a practitioner of Buddhism. And then she went to church one time and heard this Baptist preacher talking about Elijah's experience of God in the cave, where God doesn't appear in a big thunderstorm, a big outward manifestation, but a quiet voice. And the preacher's talking about being quiet, being calm, allowing God to come into the quiet moments. And so she, as a Buddhist practitioner, says, yeah, this is awfully familiar. And so she, in a sense, retrieved her childhood identity as a Baptist. And so as an adult, she identifies as a Black Baptist Buddhist. So this is one example of dual practice. Now, some people will say, no, you can't do that. In America, anyway, there are people who identify as both Buddhist and Christian. So this is always contextual. So it depends on what the traditions are and what the concrete context is. And so she brings in Martin Luther King Jr. And so many Buddhists in America, as Buddhists, can completely embrace the vision of the beloved community of Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was tremendously influenced by Gandhi. And when Gandhi was challenged about his struggle against the British Empire, who did he invoke? Jesus and the Buddha. So Gandhi very explicitly was following the practice of the Buddha, even though he's a Hindu, in struggling against the British Empire. This inspired African Americans. And so this is part of the Black Buddhist Baptist identity. Another Black Buddhist, Pamela Ayo Yutanda, who has a legal background, she looks at legal issues with regard to transgender persons in hospitals. And as an African American, she draws on womanist scholarship and transgender analysis. So there's a lot of this exploration of intersectionality. There were a number of partnerships that developed in the United States in the 1960s. Thich Nhat Hanh came to the US in about 1968, became a friend of Thomas Merton and also of Martin Luther King Jr. So this is one of the more dramatic areas where Buddhists and Christians had a common cause and began working together. And there's a number of other formats in which there were similar efforts. Nikio Nawano was one of the founders of the Risho Kosakai movement. He interpreted the Lotus Sutra as completely rejecting the Japanese imperialism that was supported by some Buddhists during the imperial period. And he met with Pope Paul VI in 1964, and they discussed anti-nuclear work, because both Pope Paul VI and Nikkyo Niwano were very concerned that no nation ever used nuclear weapons again. This prompted Nikkyo Niwano. He felt tremendously welcomed by the Catholics at the Second Vatican Council. He then founded the World Conference of Religions for Peace. Now they simply call it Religions for Peace, but it's actualizing various religious traditions to work together on peace projects. Currently, I work with Won Buddhists from South Korea in the Interfaith Coalition Conference for Global Citizens. So this started during COVID when they asked me to talk about what's the future of religion after COVID. And I talked about the biases against Asians in the United States at that time. And since then, we've met in various places, including the United Nations Church Center in New York City. We had Ban Ki-moon as our keynote speaker in Seoul. We'll meet in Bangkok in August. So it's bringing together Buddhists and Christians and other religious practitioners as well to try to counter the polarization and the bias in our world. One of the great leaders was Aloysius Pyrrhus, who just left us about a month ago, a couple of weeks before Easter. He was a pioneer in developing an Asian liberation theology in response to the many religions and the many poor. And he had a doctorate in Theravada Buddhism as practiced in Sri Lanka. And he pioneered a method of artistic dialogue where he would invite Buddhist artists to come and present artwork based on biblical figures. He's not trying to convert them, but he would talk with them about the meaning of the biblical figures. And then he wanted to know how they, as Buddhists, could respond in this world of so much suffering. But what's the teaching of the Buddha? One brief phrasing is, I teach suffering in the end of suffering. So we have a shared commitment to relieving suffering. Another area is the dialogue of intellectual exchange. There's two aspects here. One is interpreting scriptures. Another is more philosophical, reinterpreting doctrines. A lot of what's going on right now is people reading the other traditions' scriptures and then responding in a sympathetic way. In our past, Christians often used to read the Bible against other religions. Today, we read the Bible with other religions in a friendly way, looking for shared values. And so there's a whole series of explorations of this. The historical critical method can be used, like the pair that I mentioned before, Ulrich Luz and Michael Axels, use historical critical scholarship to look at what can scholarship tell us about the early Christian and Buddhist traditions, about Jesus and the Buddha as historical figures, but they don't restrict it only to that. Then they look further at dimensions of religious practice. The method I have used often is based on the wisdom tradition of ancient Israel, who believed that wisdom is in creation itself, and they were in dialogue with people from Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so I treat the Buddha as a wisdom teacher. And I compared wisdom sayings in the Dhammapada with wisdom sayings in the Bible and the later Christian tradition. Cosmologically, often our worldview has very major differences. But if you ask traditional Buddhists and traditional Christians what gets us in trouble, well, Buddhists talk about the three poisons: ignorance, craving, anger. Thomas Aquinas talks about the roots of sin in very similar terms: ignorance, concupiscence, malice. So in terms of what are the virtues, like a Catholic can accept the Brahma Viharas, the dwelling places of the Buddha, and value them. And Buddhists often resonate with virtues prized in the Christian tradition. My own mentor was Masao Abe, a Japanese Buddhist out of the Kyoto school. He used to read the Christian Bible in light of a Mahayana Buddhist logic of negation. So the early Mahayana thinker Nagarjuna had this logic: A is not A, therefore A is truly A. So Abe would read the hymn in the letter of Paul to the community in Philippi, where the Son of God empties himself. He doesn't cling to divinity. The Son of God is not the Son of God because he empties himself. Therefore, he is truly the Son of God, precisely because of his emptying. And so he wanted to challenge Buddhists to a more dynamic understanding of shunyata based on his dialogue with Jews and Christians. And then he turned around and he would ask Christians, can you say God is emptiness or God is emptying? And some people like Hans Küng and Wolfhard Pannenberg said, nine, 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 nine. You can't do that. No, no. It's only Christ who empties himself in the Bible, they said, not God the Father. But he wanted an authoritative answer. So Donald Mitchell, great colleague in the US, he engineered an appointment in Rome with the aides to then Cardinal Ratzinger at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And he asked them the same question, and they said yes. They were influenced by Hans Urs von Balthasar, where the emptying of God the Son in the incarnation expresses the primordial emptying of God the Father in the Christian belief in the Trinity. The Father gives away all divinity to the Son and the Spirit, except for the distinct property of being Father. So there's an overflowing and emptying of divinity within the Trinity. And both sides agreed that Mahayana Buddhists would mean emptying in a very different sense than Catholics would, but nonetheless, the same image could be used by both traditions. So Abe came back to the United States thinking the people in the Vatican were more liberal than most of the people he met in the United States. Abe didn't so much convince people to agree with him, but he stimulated dialogue. He paired up with John Cobb, and the two of them had, they ended up calling it the Cobb-Abe group. But a lot of the leading Christian theologians in the 1980s and 90s came to this. And there were leading Buddhists from both the United States and Asia, and sometimes from Europe, that would come and be part of these discussions. So a lot of the US discussion came out of this. There's a lot more. I want to move on to the final section on spiritual practice, because this is where it really becomes more practical. We can talk about more of any of these dimensions to the degree that you're interested. So the final is the dialogue of spiritual experience. So as neighbors, we share common concerns. We can talk about the more academic intellectual background, but in many ways, the crux of the matter is what's at the core of our religious lives? What's our religious practice? What's our spiritual life really about? And again, in history, often there were very negative perceptions on both sides. So you can find very prejudicial statements in earlier periods. Two of the great breakthroughs were two meetings. First, Thomas Merton went to India in 1968 and he met the young Dalai Lama. And like I mentioned before, the young Dalai Lama had a negative image of Christians, but the two of them hit it off. And Merton originally was not all that enthused about meeting what he called the Tibetan Pope. But once they met, these negative perceptions just faded away. And this often is what happens when you're face to face with another person. Whatever you thought before may not be applicable. And then you realize, well, you're not exactly the image that I thought you were supposed to be. And this is where a breakthrough can come. So this is one great inspiring moment. A couple years later, a leading Thai Buddhist went to the Vatican, met with Pope Paul VI. And Pope Paul VI had a private interview with the person. And afterwards, the Pope asked Cardinal Pignatelli, he was the Vatican official for interreligious relations, to talk to the head of the Benedictine order, Rembert Weekland, about having Catholic monks talk to Buddhist monks. So Pope Paul VI had an intuition, monastics can talk to monastics. Even though there's huge differences of language, culture, religion, history, monks are monks, and they share something. This is the origin of dialogue interreligieux monastique, monastic interreligious dialogue. I used to be an advisor to the North American monastic interreligious dialogue. In Europe, they usually use the French title, but it's one global organization. And so we had the first Gethsemane encounter at the monastery of Thomas Merton in the summer of 1996. I was an advisor for it. And so this is a direct result of these two meetings. So Thomas Merton was always in the background. Merton died in Bangkok in 1968, but his memory was everywhere. We had a whole prayer service, and the Dalai Lama reveres the memory of Thomas Merton. And the other side was Pope Paul VI's support for this. And the Buddhists were tremendously moved. Some of the Buddhists said, after the first couple days, when you get below the earth soil, the topsoil, to the deep soil underneath, the differences don't matter as much. This was not in a university. It was not in a conference center. It was not in a hotel. It was a monastery where Merton used to talk about the dialogue of those who have kept their silences. So the Buddhists felt at home in a monastery. Trappists spend long periods of time in silent meditation. They get up 3:30 a.m. Well, a lot of Buddhists get up that time. If you're in a Buddhist monastery, there's often a pre-dawn chanting. And so there was a kind of a commonality that emerged through the period. At one point, I was sitting next to Geshe Zopa. He had been an examiner for the Dalai Lama. I had a lecture at my university earlier, and intellectual matters for him were totally different. But sitting next to me at one point after the dialogue, we sat in silence, and everyone was invited to say one word into the silence. His word, unity. And so he's not giving up on the academic differences, but beyond all that, there's a point of unity. In terms of the ongoing practice in the United States, there are basically two models of Christians doing some form of meditation practice that comes from Buddhism. The Carmelites do Vipassana out of the Theravada tradition. Jesuits do Zen. That's kind of shorthand, but as a rule, these are the trends that we've had in the United States. So there's different Carmelites. Mary Jo Meadow, Kevin Culligan, Daniel Chowning did practice of Vipassana meditation, and their spiritual mentor is St. John of the Cross. John of the Cross talks about purification. You go through a dark night of the senses, dark night of the soul. It's letting go, letting go, letting go. And so if you're doing Vipassana, a Theravada Buddhist practice, it's not too difficult to see this as purifying. So there's a whole book, Purifying the Heart, where these Carmelites talk about the benefits of Theravada Buddhist practice. Then Mary Jo Meadow wrote a sequel, Gentling the Heart, on metta practice. In metta practice, Buddhists send out the four dwelling places of the Buddha. So you're sending out compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, appreciative joy to all the people in the universe. And so the Carmelites expressed the hope, I quote, by offering an ancient Buddhist meditation practice within a Christian prayer tradition, we hope to teach our readers a process of inner purification that we believe can lead to deeper Christian faith in this world and the direct vision of God in the next. So this is the hope. On the Jesuit side, Hugo La Sala was a German Jesuit, went to Japan in the 1930s. And as a missioner, he wants to get to know the culture. In 1943, he began a little bit practice of Zen. Then he survived the nuclear bomb at Hiroshima. He was on the outskirts. He had glass in his back, and the future head of the Jesuit order pulled the glass out, and he was able to survive. After World War II was over, he went into sustained Zen practice, and he became one of the pioneers. And for him, there was a complementarity between Ignatius of Loyola talks about being a contemplative in action, and he found Zen as a path to be a contemplative in action. So he's not renouncing his Catholic Jesuit identity, but he's expanding it by entering into the practice of Zen. And this inspired a whole series of other people. Ruben Habito, a friend of mine, he was a younger Jesuit at that point in Japan, and he came to Kensho, to seeing clearly very quickly. In the United States, Robert Kennedy, not the famous one now, but a Jesuit, taught at Jersey City for many years. He had a zendo in the Jesuit residence in Jersey City. This is right across from Lower Manhattan. I used to go over and sit with him on Saturday morning. So again, he's integrating the practice of Zen meditation into his life as a Jesuit Catholic priest. So this has been pretty widely discussed. The great critic of these approaches is Roger Corliss. He was eccentric. He was kind of a curmudgeon at times, but he was also had a heart of gold underneath. He was a great scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, and he was a third order Benedictine. So he's very devout, kind of a lay Benedictine practitioner who, with the permission of his Catholic spiritual director, took refuge in a Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And he used to challenge people who are doing Vipassana or Zen. That's the easy way out because you're simply sitting and following your breath. Tibetan Buddhist meditation is different, where you're imaging. You have all these different figures going on. And so he wanted to respect the otherness of the two traditions in his practice. So he set up his week. Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, he would do Roman Catholic Benedictine type morning prayer. Liturgy of the Hours. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, he would do Tibetan Buddhist meditation, where he's imaging Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and all these heavenly beings. And he would say when he's in the Catholic world, the Buddhist world was at best irrelevant, if not false. When he was in the Buddhist world, the Catholic world was at best irrelevant, if not false. But the way we've arranged our week, we have a Sabbath. So on the Sabbath, he would sit and watch the two worlds come together. And he would say publicly, I don't know what's going on. But he thought a limited number of people had a vocation to experiment with this kind of dual practice without judging it. So he was critical of people who have too easy a resolution of the whole question, can you be both Buddhist and Christian? But he was following his own, in a sense, more difficult path, challenging everybody to recognize both how radically different we are, but also how the two paths can flow together. So I thank you for your attention.
I would like to apologize for my being late because I had my tennis lesson. And my teacher told me if I keep skipping class one more time, he will give my time slot to others. So I said that I just finished hosting a big conference on Dunhuang. So I thought maybe it's a good break. I told you all about this because I think contextual understanding is very important. I think the only reason I'm here, my research is not on dialogue. The only reason I'm here is that this is a topic I gave. And yeah, when Professor Ren asked me, do you have any suggestion? This is the topic. And the reason I gave this topic is because I'm responsible for MA program in Buddhist studies. And there are 3 MA program of Buddhist studies in Hong Kong. And we are the only one housed under religious studies. And to me, my training has always been, I graduated from here, religious studies. My training has always been religious studies. And I think religious studies, the basic thing is the methodology. And I'm strongly convinced. My conviction is that, biblical study has developed a much better methodology in religious study than other disciplines. And we have to admit that. So a lot of people will think that, okay, those things are developed in the West, in other tradition, which cannot be applied to the East. But I think let's do some phenomenology of religion here. Let's bracket out, your judgment first. Let's take a look at what are they. So I think we are the only program in the world that we invite a biblical scholar to teach methodology course in a program. Right now, to avoid criticism, I pretend to co-teach the course with her. But then, actually, well, in the future, maybe year after this year, then I will invite her to teach the whole, just to learn. this is my conviction. I think we could truly learn something from other tradition. Yeah, this is one thing. Um, uh, to tell you the truth, I'm very suspicious on Christian Buddhist or dialogue, religious dialogue. One reason is because when I came here to teach in English University, actually a senior scholar, Daniel Overmeyer, he passed away now. He was a Chinese religion scholar. So, he gave me a lot of advices on how to move forward after finishing my thesis. He said, so at one point I suggested maybe I'm also interested in, Catholic Buddhist dialogue. He said, don't. No, this is a separate field. They are people. So and then he guided me to do field work. So most of our research will go to marginal places, not only grassroots level. I work on Buddhism, but not the Buddhism understood by most people, but those are practiced on the grassroots level. By grassroots level, actually, it's marginal. Those sometimes are not considered to be Buddhism by the Buddhist. In any way, so because of that kind of experience, I'm always suspicious about the meta level discussion of comparison and those kind of dialogue. I mean they are very valuable, but those are not my cup of tea. What I so I well actually well I should praise you first, but actually my sharing is a sharing because I'm not in the field. I'm not a scholar doing dialogue, but I have also another strong, apart from the conviction of methodology, I also have a strong conviction on dialogue in action. I think that is the only, because whenever I read a paper by student on dialogue, I always ask him, why are you doing this? What purpose you want to serve? Out of intellectual curiosity is one. Okay, that's fine. What aims you want to attain. I think one of the thing is I think it's related to the topic of your next topic. The 17, we always talk about a sustainable development goal proposed by you. This is not only a term, it is a real crisis. It's really dangerous, although ignored by some, some leaders, political leaders, saying that this is a scam. There's no, but anyway, but this is a very the only way out. I think no one nation could solve the problem. No one religion can solve. We have to pool our resources. So I think this is the entry point. I see the value of religious dialogue. So from my own experience, I'm not a scholar, so I'm not criticizing or arguing against the whole field. I mean this, I can see a very strong value in this. Whether you call it preferential option for the poor or whatever you say, we have to do something. And when you do something together, the differences does not matter. And you can see the similarity, the true one. And the best thing, the most beautiful things is you involve everyone, not only people on the top. Like Hong Kong, we have religious dialogue every year, every New Year. All the top people sit together, have a banquet and talk about things. But then if dialogue in action involve all the levels, every people involved and everybody contribute. And then I think I see a very high value in that kind of. So I can only share my my personal view on this. The other thing I want to say, when I read, I'm very sorry that the other may not be able have the opportunity to read your paper. It is so rich and so good. Your breadth of knowledge, I'm just speechless. And one thing, one thing I have to share is that is the literature review, how you review the whole thing. We have AI which can do literature review very well today. So starting from this year, I noticed that when I compare the students' paper submitted, the only draft actually submitted to me this year, compared with last year, the literature will have improved substantially and remarkably, which make me wonder whether how much AI has helped, you know. So, but then, so the next thing I could do is to, but I have to pay, you know, only the paid version can do a good version. I would ask them to write a variety of methods in Buddhist-Christian studies there and compare with yours. Yours is a real one, you know, it reflects the depth and breadth of your knowledge, you know, is that, and then how the AI come out and then so we can have more. So this is when I read through, you know, I was really truly moved. I mean, how, you know, this is what a scholar should be, you know, the kind of, you know, understanding the depth of the whole field, and then you argue from that. I mean, those are the things I would like to share. I mean, I cannot because you know, I'm not in the field basically, and I has explained. I'm glad that our colleagues is here, you know, from biblical studies. If she can share a few words, that would be very nice, you know, because she has been teaching Buddhist studies students for a few years under my pressure. I was the chairperson, and that impression did not go away. So people think, which is an illusion. People think that when I ask them to do something, they should do it, but that's not true. You know. Well, anyway, thank you very much for your and also I also actually support inviting you here. Is that we would like to develop a course on interfaith dialogue within our Buddhist studies. I think that's one thing of doing things, of studying Buddhism. So your paper is very, very useful, and your coming serve the purpose. That's what I proposed. But thank you for, you know, Professor Ren agree inviting you here and speak on this topic. So I mean that's all. I'm speaking from my heart and sharing. Yeah, and then we should, you know, switch to a real scholar of, you know, in the field, Christian, you know, Buddhist dialogue. Okay, thank you, Professor.
Okay, may I check how many minutes I have?
Oh, as long as you take.
Okay, yeah. I start with a little story. Unlike Professor Tam, he's a few years senior than me. When I came to see. Okay. No. When I came to CHK as the first year undergraduate student, he is in the graduating class. Yeah. So he's my師兄. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But we have different approach. Yeah. When I finished my undergraduate BA degree, we are asked to wrote a at that time I wrote a graduation paper, which is a comparison between Buddhism and Christianity. So I start my interest in that comparison quite early. At that time, I wrote a paper on the doctrinal classification in Chinese Buddhism. The Chinese Buddhism, they try to classify the Buddhist scriptures according to a scheme in order to highlight which is the perfect teaching, which one is less perfect, in order to find out which is the hardcore or the supreme teaching of the Buddha, and what are the lesser important scriptures, something like that. I argue that Christianity should learn something from that. Okay, that is my undergraduate paper. Okay, when I did my master degree thesis, actually I wrote on John Cobb. You mentioned his name, yeah, and I use his theory about the Buddhist-Christian dialogue. I apply it to Christian-Confucian dialogue. Yeah, so when I did my PhD thesis on Portilic, you know, he's also one of the few Christian theologians at that time engaging in the dialogue with Buddhism. Yeah, so I have my interest quite early. You talk about Overmyer. You know that Overmyer had a dialogue with me and published it in Ching Feng. Yeah, about Christianity and Chinese religion. At that time we talk about one thing is about salvation. How the Chinese religions think about salvation and what is its meaning for Christianity. At that time, I argue for a point of view that salvation can be multi-dimensional. Yeah, that is the draw from politics understanding that life is a multidimensional unity. And the Chinese religions, from time to time, they are not talking about salvation in the terms of, if you die, you will go to heaven, your soul will go to heaven, something like that. But sometimes talk about very down to earth concern. Okay, I'm sick and I get healed. That is salvation. I don't have a child, a male child. I look for it, and then eventually I got one. Okay, that is salvation. Okay, or getting rich. Yeah, that is salvation. Something like that. Or I passed my exam. Okay, I got my doctoral degree. That is salvation. Okay, they can talk about that in a very in a sense materialistic, but sometimes it's psychological. Okay, I can't get sleep well, or I have a very bad relationship with my wife or whatever, can be social dimension. Of course, it can be spiritual dimension. Okay, yeah. So salvation can be multidimensional. Yeah, that shaped my understanding of the dialogue between Christianity and Confucianism, and also particularly Christianity and Buddhism. I think that kind of understanding is particularly helpful, yeah, because it can bypass some of the misunderstanding from Christian theology. From time to time, they think about when they talk about pluralism, inclusivism, and exclusivism, they assume there is some sort of a fixed hardcore salvation defined in Christian term. But actually, other religions don't think about salvation in similar terms. So in case we need to be more respectful to other religions' understanding of salvation, we better to have a more multidimensional understanding of salvation. It will enrich our conversation. It's not just about talking about, whether a Buddhist, if he convert to Christianity before he die, he will go to heaven or what, or Buddhist and Christian will meet in heaven or something like that. No. We can talk about salvation in a very materialistic way. Yeah, whether we can contribute to society's well-being, the psychological well-being of individuals or something like that. Yeah, it's also possible topics. Yeah, so tell you another story that I was invited by a encyclopedia to exactly to write an article on Buddhist-Christian studies, trying to do a survey. So I'm so glad that you did it because I turned down the invitation because I think it's a huge task. Yeah, because there are so many books, so many articles, and also one problem is that it's a multilingual project. Because the dialogue between Buddhism and Christianity are taking place in various contexts in China, in Japan, Korea, America, Europe, and somewhere else. So it's very difficult to survey all the details. Yeah. So eventually, after reading your paper, I come up with a scheme and then just share with you and see if it's useful. For example, I was also trained in philosophy. I prefer to think in a very logical way. When we talk about Buddhist-Christian studies, there are 4 possible approaches. One is from a Buddhist approach, another is Christian approach, one is both Buddhist and Christian, and the fourth one is neither Buddhist nor Christian. I think that is a possibility, especially when I conduct a survey on the Buddhist-Christian encounter in China. I find that there are some very interesting stuff. Yeah. Talking about dual identity between Buddhism and Christianity, there will be one, say, Xu Dishan. He's a literate, a novelist, also a scholar of religious studies. If you look into his life, sometimes people recognize his literature as Christian literature, but the Buddhists will say his literature is Buddhist literature because he married a Buddhist wife. As a Christian, yeah, he baptized it and buried it as a Christian. Okay. Yeah, but in his literature, you will find that all the religions can live, so say, in sometimes in a very harmonious way. Sometimes you can think about, you wonder whether his love to his wife and some others is a Buddhist love or Christian love. You cannot tell. And another guy I study is called Zhang Chunyi. He was he converted to Christianity during the teenagers, and then at that time he think about how to integrate Buddhism with Christianity in order to indigenize Christianity. Okay, yeah, he did a comparison and say, Christianity is very simple, straightforward, the best religion, something like that. But after becoming a Christian for some years, he converted back to Buddhism and say that Buddhism is much better than Christianity. Christianity should become a branch or a denomination of Buddhism. So from time to time, you'll find that his identity, his own religious identity is quite blurred. You are not so sure whether he is a Buddhist or Christian. Yeah, so that's why Perry Smith and Luckett and Paul Smith, Paul Nitter and some others talk about the dual identity. From time to time, we find some people have this kind of dual identity. There is not clearly distinguished, I'm a Buddhist or I'm a Christian, but seems to both. Yeah. So I think that is also an important category that perhaps we can think about the four possible approach. Yeah. And each possible approach, say the Christian, you can have a very pluralistic, inclusivist or exclusivist or even comparative theology approach. Yeah. Try to learn from others. Yeah. I think I can find some similar example from Buddhism. They have this kind of approaches. Some will say Buddhism is better than Christianity. That is the inclusivism. One will say, oh, Buddhism is true and Christianity is wrong. Okay, that is inclusivism. Some will say adopt a pluralistic approach, and some will even talk about how Buddhism can learn from Christianity. That is a very comparative theology approach. Yeah. So I think I can try to classify in these four ways. For the neither Buddhist nor Christian, it will be a philosophical approach, scientific approach or sociological approach or whatever. Yeah, you can think about that. Even a anti-religious approach is possible. Yeah, you can do comparison in that perspective. So I will try to classify in this way. Yeah, because if I just look into all the publication, it's very confusing. There are huge diversities. They're too diversified. Yeah, so I try to classify them. Another way is to classify them is not according to the approach, it's according to the topics. Yeah, you propose a four-flow approaches, dialogue of life, dialogue with action, dialogue intellectual exchange, dialogue with the rich experience. I find similar typology from a scholar called Paul O. Ingram. You mentioned his name. Yeah, but his approach is more simplified. Yeah, socially engaged. That's quite similar to the liberation theology approach or what Professor Tam talked about. Wow, we need to take care about the poor and the grassroots. Yeah. Another is intellectual. Yeah, it can be a comparison of scripture or comparison with doctrine or philosophy or whatever. That is, we scholars, we like to do that. Another is interior dialogue. It's talking about the religious experience. So it's quite comparable to the fourfold typology you talk about, excepting that the dialogue with life, he did mention that. Yeah, he's just talk about dialogue with interior experience, intellectual, and also socially engaged. Yeah, but the problem is, what is life? Whether life also includes some intellectual thing, or life also include the social engaged aspect, something like that. Yeah, so I think that can be further discussed. Yeah, should be threefold, fourfold, or fifthfold, whatever. That is, all of them are possible. My personal preference is to adopt the scheme proposed by Leland Smart. Yeah, he preferred a 7 dimensions of religions. I think we can do the comparison or dialogue and possibly on these 5 dimensions: the social, political, the ethical, the doctrinal, philosophical, the scriptural or narrative, and also the ritual, and also the material experience, something like that. Yeah, so I think that may be another scheme which we can consider how to classify various methods. Because and of course some of them are not prominent. For example, ritual, some of them they do ritual studies, but not so many. Yeah. Or the organization of the religion, not so many. Although there are a few books talking about their monastic rules. That is the belonging to that organization aspect. So I think that scheme may be more helpful to help us to think about not just what are already done, but also can perceptually conceive what can be possibly done in the future. Yeah. So I just share my experience and observation here. Yeah. And one thing is that perhaps because I'm working from, say, in Asia, I'm more aware of the Asian scholars, their response to Christianity. And sometimes I find that it must be very careful. Sometimes they will have to do the so-say inclusivism the other way around. I call it the reversal Orientalism. That is the term coined by Bernard Faure, talking about Kyoto School. Sometimes they may twist the Western understanding in order to prove that Japanese Buddhism is much better than the Western. Yeah, but I think even in that case, I think that will provoke some very interesting dialogue there. You mentioned the response from Hans Küng, Mukman, Cobb, etc., etc. In fact, I also wrote an article to respond to that. My argument is that perhaps Maso Abe misinterpreted text and also misinterpreted Buddhism. Yeah, because my understanding is that the text, he is based on the second chapter of the Philippians. Yeah, he just focused on emptying, Christ emptying himself, and he argued that even God himself should emptying himself. So it's not the emptying of Christ, but emptying of God's self. Yeah, to argue in that way. But I think if you look into the scripture carefully, you will find that the major thing is not the emptiness, but before that, Paul talked about the koinonia. People, you should not just look after yourself, but you should look after one another, something like that. So the whole story is not the emptying of Christ himself, but after the crucifixion, etc., is the resurrection and the glorification. Is to show that you're giving yourself out, you are receiving something back. So it's not a one-way unilateral sacrifice, but it's a reciprocal communion. I think that will be a better interpretation of the Bible and also a better interpretation of the Mahayana understanding of emptiness. That is the interdependence. Yeah. So that is my little story to show that I find that sometimes the Japanese Buddhism, in order to show that they are better than Christianity, they will twist the biblical text and also twist their own understanding of Buddhism in order to hide that, okay, our talk about absolute nothingness is better than the ontology of being in Christianity, overlooking that there are a lot of discussion about nothingness in Christianity. And also, from the Buddhist perspective, sometimes Maso Abe himself also admitted that when I talk about absolute nothingness, yeah, that is beyond the relative being and relative non-being. And my question is, why not absolute being that is beyond the relative being and relative non-being? And I find in sometimes he admitted, they are more or less the same. And then I was the question. So in that case, you are just putting up a rhetoric in order to show that Japanese Buddhism is better than Christianity. That's all. Yeah. So I think the critique of reverse Orientalism really stands. Yeah. So just share with you my essential my practical concern that when I do the dialogue in Asia, sometimes I have to face this kind of challenges, how to clarify the position of Christianity and to engage in sometimes critical dialogue with the practitioner of Buddhism or Confucianism. Yeah, so that sometimes that may be. Sometimes Western scholars do not want to do it. Yeah, I understand that. Say when the one who proposed comparative theology from Harvard, Frank Kunitz. Yeah. I think it's very humble that try to advocate the idea of comparative theology. That okay, we should be very humble, try to learn from other religions, reading their texts, whatever, and try to reflect critically on our own Christian tradition. But I think we should do it the other way around as well. Yeah, so I prefer the phraseology of Alvin Sharma talking about reciprocal illumination. Yeah, sometimes when we engage in the Buddhist text, yeah, okay, for example, of course I can think about how to think critically on the Christian tradition, but sometimes I also can spot something which Christianity can contribute to the Buddhist critical reflection on the Buddhist tradition. So that is beyond the methodology of comparative theology. But I think that is very important because this is really an example of showing the Christian love. You try to share what you have with the others. Yeah, and also that is in the spirit of the Mahayana Buddhism, the benevolence or compassion that try to save yourself and save the others at the same time. Yeah, I think that is the Buddhist practice. So, so for my methodology, I would prefer to adopt a more reciprocal approach instead of very unilateral one, just to reflect quickly on the Christian tradition by reading the Confucian text or the Buddhist text. Yeah. So I finished my sharing.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Liu, and thank you, Professor Lai and Professor Tam, for your insightful sharing. My question is, I am Erica Lee from the Holy Spirit Institute of Theology, the seminary, the Catholic seminary in Hong Kong. In terms of methodology about Christian and Buddhist dialogue, I'm thinking because of the issue of traditions within tradition, because we all know that within Buddhism, there are various traditions, the Theravada and Mahayana. I'm thinking in terms of Christian Buddhist dialogue or studies, can we learn something from the dialogue within the various traditions within Buddhism? Because I assume that there are always dialogue or sometimes even conflicts of views about which is the true tradition within Buddhism. So I'm thinking in terms of Christian Buddhist dialogue, can we learn something from the dialogue within the traditions of Buddhism themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. Many years ago, I was in Kyoto and Abe Masao introduced me to Ryusei Takeda. He was one of the leading Pure Land Buddhist scholars at the time. And in Japan, Buddhism became sectarian. This is not true in China, to my understanding. But in Japan, hundreds of years ago, the different Buddhist sects stopped talking to each other. And so in the 1980s, there's this beginning of Buddhist-Christian dialogue, and all these different Buddhist traditions are seated around the table talking to Christians. And so after they talk to the Christians, they then start to look at each other and say, well, if all of us can talk to the Christians, why can't we talk to each other? And they had no history of doing it in Japan. And so they asked then the Christians, how do you do your own inner Christian ecumenical dialogue at all? And so he told me, at least in that context in Kyoto, it was a fruitful learning experience for the Japanese. When I was at the first World Buddhist Forum in Guangzhou a number of years ago, the Minister of Religious Affairs from Sri Lanka was pleading with the Theravada Buddhists not to dismiss all the Mahayana Buddhists. Because for many Theravada Buddhists, there's this old bias that Mahayana Buddhists just make it up, because the Mahayana Sutras are much later. So there's major challenges within the Buddhist world. And sometimes, kind of ironically, by coming into dialogue with somebody who's really other, like Christians, they begin to see their own struggles in a new light. Now, at the other end, you have many people in American Buddhism who don't have that strong a doctrinal commitment to any one particular religious tradition. Here, one of the best overviews is Joseph Goldstein. He's originally a practitioner of Burmese meditation practice out of U Pandita, but then later he practiced Zen and also practiced Tibetan. And for him, and he's talked about this publicly, at one point he's with the Tibetans and they're talking about a particular figure who's reincarnated. Now he knows in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, that person's gone, is not coming back. And so it set up this inner tension for himself. And so he wrote a book called One Dharma, where he basically kind of relativizes the differences among the different Buddhist traditions. And he basically singles out the three that he knows best. So the Vipassana out of Burma, and then the Tibetan, and then the Zen out of Japan. And he does kind of an analysis of way American Buddhists are forming a new type of Sangha. not in the strict traditional sense, but this new form of Buddhist unity. And in the United States, one of the big challenges, you have European American Buddhists or African American Buddhists, and they've often got either Judaism or Christianity in their gut. And they may or may not still identify as Jewish or Christian. This is the whole dual, but a lot of them have left that behind, but it's still there. I was at one conference where there's this British gentleman in his Zen robes. He gets up there and says, every European or European American Buddhist is either Jewish or Christian, and we have to talk about it. And so nobody talked about it. And so a lot of this is being sorted out. At the second Gethsemane encounter, there was a little break after dinner before the evening session, and the Buddhists would meet themselves to get to know each other. And they talked about either how someone came to America or how someone came to the Dharma. Because they were basically either immigrants or converts from Judaism or Christianity. And a lot of the Christians are Catholic. And listen, I was in one dialogue with John Daido Luri, one of the leading Zen teachers, a wonderful teacher of Dogen to an American audience. And at one point, he just blurts out, I'm still Catholic. And I didn't have any problem with that. His Zen students did. But it was just kind of one of these things. So some Buddhists can be very opening and welcoming of differences, and that can be a certain type of model for handling differences. Others are more doctrinal. I've heard this especially from Sri Lankan Theravada Buddhists, where the teaching of the Buddhists is very clear, and it contradicts a lot of the claims of Mahayana folk, and they just think, well, you have to go back to the original teaching of it. So I guess I would mainly stress the diversity, and certainly in the United States, something new is taking place, because you've never had all these different Buddhist traditions coming together in our type of context before. Like the Dalai Lama said that he was being consulted by the American Buddhists at one point, and he said, we're making it up as we go along. So, yeah.
Well, what can we discuss?
Sure, sure.
I'm saying it's fine. I think we can listen to each other.
Yeah.
I think when you ask whether or not we can learn from the dialogue between traditions, the answer will be very embarrassing because they will do worse than interreligious dialogue. Look at the Buddhists. They have association of Buddhism, which supposed to organize, harmonize different sections, but nobody listens to them. It's become a separate institution, and then you have others, either for Guangshan or same thing to the Christian. They have united church, which united, but it become a separate church. So it's worse, So, but your point is very important when you talk about Christian Buddhist dialogue. Which Buddhism, which Christianity, right? That's very true. And then there's a diversity, within that part. So, but
and there's some on both sides that are just not interested in dialogue.
yeah,
There's some Christians that have no use for this at all, and some Buddhists that,
we are complete.
Yeah.
So how about the issue of feminism, gender issue? What do you mean? It seems to be that to bring up another reminds me an issue that there are lots of say within Christianity they have the dialogue about the gender balance and Buddhism they also think about that because there are some say Buddhist practice assuming that the superiority of the body about the nuns and they have to think about the validity of the narrative that even a very good Buddhist nun had to reincarnate again as a male in order to get an entitlement. So even Buddhism, they have to struggle with that kind of gender equality in their religion. So sometimes it becomes a focus of dialogue between Buddhism and Christianity. They are coming to Of course, there are some interesting cases. I really take Rose. I think she originally a Christian, but eventually converted to Buddhism. Because she finds that she feels more comfortable as a feminist to be a Buddhist instead of Christianity, because she finds that Christianity is too patriarchal, oppressive to the woman. So I think that is another issue we can have dialogue. How to overcome that kind of.
Oh yeah, I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, because during the people I am not even this color. But I just think that in terms of methodology, I think it is true that biblical studies do well developed, and I entered I took up this challenge without much knowledge of Buddhism, but as I delved into Buddhist scripture, I realized how much I learned from Buddhist scripture, and that how relevant our methodology could be applied in scriptures, and challenge not only contents of the scriptures on episode service, but also reflect on some of the things that we encounter in Christianity might be, also be same issue being addressed in as well. I mean, Richard Ross, is exactly addressing patriarchal ideology within Buddhism, and it's the sort of things that we have to do with the knowledge mission as well. So in the way I see it is that because feminism or feminist interpretation of the Bible is not just about feminism, it's like that includes a lot of different cultures, and we incorporate it, we bend it, cultural abilities, communities of resistance, communities of suspicion, and I find it interesting and intrigued that I could actually use what I'm learning in studies to analyze Richard Ross' writing, see kind of points that she is taking on and how she changed over time. And also things like knowledge. It used to be a huge debate in biblical theology that whether biblical theology should be nominative or descriptive or, or something else, okay? Or maybe like more towards constructive now. And it used to be a huge debate of these 1800th century till now. And it was really interesting to see that some of the Buddhist scholars turned from descriptive to nominative.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. We're more young, we're not So, but I found that lots of things that I'm not just coming from the perspective of biblical scholar, going into this new domain that I found a lot of things very intriguing. And I'm not sure where I would go. I would have people say that I'm going into Buddhist-Christian dialogue or study. I can't really put the two into study. I'm still at a stage of observing the similarity. Several struggles or challenges that we are facing in both Buddhist studies and Buddhism. I really appreciate all the opportunity. Had Professor had not invited me to teach, I wouldn't have learned so much. Oh, and I do have a question actually. And so when I was a grad student, that was many years ago, I used to heard of this term called Buddhist theology.
Yeah.
A book on Buddhist theology. And I was really intrigued, like using a concept like theology. Describe Buddhist, Buddhist teachings, and this is like we have this sort of like with that language. You say one religious stuff is person language to analyze another. Is this happening even like in Buddhism, Buddhist Christian?
Yeah, there's no agreement on this. You're raising a very important point. John McCransky edited a book some years ago using the title Buddhist theology. So John and his colleagues think, like him, think there's enough analogy between what Buddhists are doing in their academic reflection and what Christians are doing that Buddhists can appropriate the term theology in their own way. Now, behind this, there is a substantive question. Let me just tell one example. There was a meeting of the Society for Buddhist-Christian Studies where Ruben Habito, claims to be a full practitioner, was doing his kind of Catholic flavored presentation of Mahayana Buddhism. So he does that. Sally King is there. Now, Sally is herself a Quaker and also a Buddhist practitioner, but she was coming back pretty hard, critiquing Ruben for doing this assimilation of Mahayana Buddhism to something more theistic sounding and so on. And she was the side of Buddhism that, no, there isn't something like divine providence in Mahayana. And Ruben said publicly, well, you've got me there. Then John McCransky gets up, and John McCransky does a critique of Western Buddhists who he thought were downplaying sides of Mahayana Buddhism that do resemble something more like divine providence. So in one sense, Buddhists don't believe in God. And this is what, in my own writing, I often thematized it. In the Abrahamic traditions, there's a hermeneutic of creation, because the relationship of creation grounds all the other in-world relationships. In Buddhism, what I call a hermeneutic of dependent co-origination, everything arises out of everything else, but no one gives the act of existing. And so that's one way to frame it all. Let's see, where was I going now? The comeback of that is functionally on a popular level in many areas of Asia. The Buddha does still function as something like a preternatural force in the present. Think of like the role of the Buddha in the Lotus. So in the Lotus Sutra, the actual narrative of the awakening of Siddhartha was not the historical awakening. He was awakened in much, much earlier time. And then he's this cosmic figure who is still active. So even when he goes into nirvana, he's not really gone. He's still intervening to skillful means. And you have the whole series of parables because we can't understand the teaching of the Buddha because we're not a Buddha. And so he graciously says all these different teachings to help lead us ineluctably over the long run. There's a universal enlightenment at the end, there'll be a long time, but everyone will come in. Now, how is that not like divine providence? That would be kind of the perception of some of what John thinks. So in my mind, often I see things as a kind of a gestalt. Buddhism, like Christianity, is multi-sided. And if we put certain aspects in the foreground, we see one reality. If we put other things in the foreground, we see something very different. And this is back to your original question of, can we use the term Buddhist theology? Well, there's sides of Buddhism you can push that it doesn't make any sense, but then there's other sides, like John McCransky would want to be, that it does make sense. I don't know if that helps. But
yes, that is sort of like cultural, right? This tragic system, system on the own discussion, right?
Yeah, you can always call religious borrowing imperialism. The thing is, we've been doing it as far as back as we have religious references. There's always this interchange taking over and so on. And sometimes you can be literally furious if we get an empire using, Egypt as world for domination for others. But I tend to be, I guess, kind of pragmatic. Does it work for this tradition over the long run? Because, I mean, in the Bible, there's appropriation from things all around ancient Israel. It's not a pure, people used to have this pure monotheism against the polytheists, and now it's much more interpenetrating, that everybody's borrowing everything else. And so, as I read the Bible, you have the polemic against idols, and on the other hand, you're borrowing from the elements all over the place. And I think the later tradition does that. We say, no, but then on the other hand, there's a lot of other stuff going. And that's true, as I understand Buddhism. This is the whole history of Buddhism. It's been very adaptable. Every culture it's gone into Buddhism has drawn in different things from different cultures. And this is what's going on in the United States right now, is my understanding, is you have Buddhists who are aware of Jewish and Christian practice. And so then why not take over the term theology and use it? Well, you're absolutely right. A purist would be thinking more like the Sally King way, that Buddhist theology is a contradiction in terms. And so I respect that. But I also recognize there's this broader practice that's not quite like that.
Yeah, but I would like to make a point that even the word theology was not originated from Christianity. It was adopted from Greek philosophy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And only Christianity adopted from Greek philosophy. Yeah. And eventually, I think there's a fine distinction is between is it someone imposed on you that will be imperialistic? If Christian theologians say, oh, that is the Buddhist theology, I think that is very imperialistic. But if it's initiated from the Buddhists themselves,
Yeah.
I cannot say it's imperialistic. It's up to them to define whether they want to do it or not. Yeah, and how they define it. I think McCransky want to just argue that Buddhism should do a more normative study of Buddhism. Yeah, unlike those study of Buddhism conducted by scholars who may not do this at all, and they just talk about the history and this word how to be translated, etc., etc. Irrelevant to the practice of the Buddhist community. And I think that is McCransky's attempt to correct that kind of tendency. Yeah. So you are quite right to point out that there is a Buddhist approach to moving towards normative studies, but there are also a Christian tendency to moving towards a more so-called objective studies.
Oh, yeah. But even in biblical studies, it's tricky. Many years ago, I was responding to John Collins, and he, in the first part of his, I say, we have to be descriptive. And then he starts getting into the issue and says, there's no theological imperative here.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't resist asking the question, what business does, or how did I put it? What business a descriptive discipline has pronouncing judgment on theological imperatives is left unclear. And this was at the Catholic Biblical Society. The whole group of biblical scholars started laughing because they realized. So even when we say we're only to be descriptive, that's part of the human practice, especially from a biblical perspective.
Yeah.
It's possible. I'm not saying it's not possible, but often there's a sleight of hand and people are slipping in more normative things.
I think people are doing, for example, people from like it now more like biological or constructional. Like I think but I can resist the tag, or I can go along with so that it's no like one answer yet. That would be normal. So I think it's neither, I would say nowadays it's like neither descriptive nor normative, but we have gone beyond that.
Yeah.
Just add another interesting note. There was a book recently published calling it Taoist theology. Yeah. And it's part of some sort of controversy within the Taoist community.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the Taoists were using the term.
Yeah,
So the Taoists, the same question. Yeah.
Nothing new on this. Still, we have impact.
Okay.
Input.
Maybe here to the last question. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a student of Professor Tam. I'm in Buddhist studies, and I'm not Buddhist. So when I look into some Catholic or Christian books, I found some similarities between those religions being practiced. First, as we know that meditation, we all know that so they are very same. Also, like the cross, the gesture of the cross, just like some movements, as carrying Buddhism, or some things are seen. Also, when I look into some images or pictures of both religions, I found that the gestures that maybe the Jesus Christ do, just like the Buddha or some Bodhisattva did images. So this is very similar. Also, I found that maybe some early Christians vegetarian. We just like the same in the vegetarian and all the putting water, actually water, which you just before the just like the water with offering for the sample of water. It's also the same. So why this is so similar? What's your thoughts about this? Because there are a long distance between the east or west, but they doing some same gestures, some same things.
And I don't know that there's any simple answer to. So we have to look at each of them and look at the context. So yeah, historically, to my knowledge, there's no direct influence of the Buddhist tradition on the world of Jesus. The first mention by a Christian author is Clement of Alexandria around the year 200 CE, where he's aware of Buddhists. It's not completely clear how much he knows about them. He's writing in Alexandria. There's been a lot of speculation about possible Buddhist influence on early Christian monasticism. There's no hard evidence of it. It's possible because there's trade between India and the Roman Empire at this time. So you can't prove a negative on this, to my knowledge. But there's no kind of smoking gun, if you will. There's no hard evidence of direct Buddhist inspiration for early Christian monasticism. And then for the sayings of Jesus and other teachings and so on, it's certainly legitimate to line up similarities between teachings. But in terms of historical influence, I just don't know of any direct, evidence for belief there. The other huge question going a little bit later is Plotinus. He's a Roman philosopher, 3rd century, who knew enough about India that he wanted to go there. But he didn't get there. The Roman emperor was killed and he went back to Rome. And there's no textual evidence of major translations from India to the Roman Empire in that context. And so we just don't know. If you go way back in history, there's obviously a link between early Sanskrit and early Greek. So in the very early stages of Greek culture, there's certainly, areas where you can find links to the very, very early Indian culture and so on. And linguistically, the New Testament is written in Greek. Greek is a cousin of Sanskrit. And so linguistically, there's all kinds of points of contact. But in terms of the details of what you're asking, I don't know.
You know what the Buddha said?
What
There are a few years that Jesus was missing.
Oh, yeah.
That was the time he went to learn about it.
Yeah.
And that's why when he came back, he can perform miracles.
And then he was buried in Kashmir. That's the hot dog of Muslims.
That's their story.
So he began it and.
Okay, well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for your rich and interesting lectures and for responses, sharings, questions, and for your participation. So please know that Professor Liu will have another lecture on next Monday, I think.
Monday?
Yes. On carrying our common home, so Christianity, Chinese religions, and the challenge of theology. So at 7 p.m. I've got it exactly there. You can find yeah, you can find a poster of this lecture on our website. So I hope to see you in future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.